In response, police have launched a full-scale search in the Mill Valley area. The boys were last seen by the bus driver after getting dropped off at the corner of Grove and Discardins Avenue, an ordinary stop, just 2 short blocks from their home. They were only 7 and 8 years old. I switched off the radio as I pulled into the driveway. The sudden silence felt like a small relief, a welcome escape from the constant stream of static-filled updates. I had listened to enough of that droning all day at work. With a tired sigh, I put the car in park, pulled the keys from the ignition, and slumped back into the seat. My bones ached, my mind fogged with the exhaustion of 11 long hours on the clock. But the rest, as always, was short-lived. Thoughts crept in, uninvited, crawling like shadows beneath a closed door. Had Homer been fed? Were the dishes done, or were they piling up in the sink, lingering, waiting for someone me to clean them? I lingered in the car a little longer, the darkness outside pressing close against the windows. I glanced towards the house, taking note of which rooms were lit and which remained in shadow. It felt like the house was watching me, waiting, just as much as I was watching it. My mind wandered back to when April and I had first met, back in the sunshine of Cal. She was a third-year business major, carefree, while I was just a few months from graduating, buried in textbooks. It felt strange to think how much things had changed, and yet not at all. Now I was the sole breadwinner, while she stayed home, supposedly taking care of herself before looking for a new job. She had left her old one because of her boss, who made her uncomfortable in those one-on-one encounters. She quit immediately, no time to line up another job. Now I was working extra hours for the both of us. She even had the gall to suggest I pick up some freelance work in my downtime, as if I even knew what that meant anymore. I glanced down at the pack of American Spirits lying against the cue folder, leaning lazily against the rotted lining. April had pushed me to quit smoking for years, and I finally did just to shut her up. But now, more than ever, the temptation to light one up called to me, not out of need or want, but as a small act of rebellion. I toyed with the idea before shaking it off. There was a bigger confrontation coming tonight, and I needed all my energy. I stepped out of the car and headed toward the house. The air was cool, pressing against my skin as I unzipped my jacket and draped it over my arm. When I slipped off my shoes at the door, I noticed something that sent a prickle up my spine. The kitchen table was empty. It was unusual. No cold leftovers, no hastily reheated meal sitting out for me. Perhaps even dinner had become too much to expect from her. Then, from the darkened living room, I heard a sound that froze my blood. A faint, broken whimper. It was quiet, barely there, like a breath that didn't quite make it to a sob. I froze, every sense straining against the silence that followed. Then voices, whispering low, just beyond the corner. One of them was April's, but the other two, they didn't belong. A chill crept down my spine. Something was very, very wrong. I wasn't expecting any company. Maybe another issue to deal with. Something lurking just on the edge of tonight's plans. I kept my steps light as I moved toward the voices, careful, as if I wanted to catch them in a conversation I had no right to hear. As I crossed into the living room, the atmosphere shifted. A heavy, suffocating weight settled in the air. April sat hunched forward on the edge of the blue, worn-out recliner, gripping the limp hand of our neighbor, Mrs. Wellwood, who sat on the couch beside her. Mr. Wellwood sat next to his wife, his face flushed and sweaty, glasses clutched tightly in one hand while he traced slow, nervous lines along the bridge of his nose with the other. April shot me a sharp look, her eyes dark with an unspoken urgency. A chill slithered down my spine. Whatever I'd imagined for the evening had dissolved into something far more unsettling. "Reggie," she said, her voice brittle, "come sit down. The Wellwoods, they need our help." I dropped my coat onto the kitchen table behind me, turning one of the chairs toward them before sitting down. The Wellwoods glanced up, forcing smiles that failed to hide their terror. "What's the matter?" I asked. April's eyes widened, as if shocked I could be so clueless. She shifted uneasily, crossing her legs in a restless motion. Jeremy and Jason. They never came home after getting off the bus today. The police are searching all over the area. Didn't you see any of the cruisers on your drive back? I thought back, and yes, I did remember seeing a few squad cars, but I hadn't given them much thought. I'd been wrapped up in my own troubles, my own battles to fight battles that would now have to wait. I glanced back at the Wellwoods. Their eyes were fixed on the untouched water glasses in front of them, hands trembling against the rims. A creeping sense of dread settled into my bones. Those kids, they were in serious trouble. I remembered Jeremy and Jason close to our son Kyle's age, but they went to private school, riding a different bus with a stop farther down the street. A sick thought wormed its way into my mind. If they had taken the same bus as Kyle, would he have been at risk too? I shivered, forcing myself to stifle the reaction, to keep my face calm. Silence stretched between us like a thread pulled too tight, until Mrs. Wellwood released a small, broken whimper. The same sound I'd heard from the hallway. Mr. Wellwood reached over, rubbing her back with slow, trembling strokes. His gaze fixed on me, desperate, as if hoping I had the answer that could make this nightmare disappear. I tried to think of something, anything to say, but my mind was a blank slate, a yawning void. I couldn't even recall their first names. It's not like them, not to come home without saying anything, he choked out. We called the school, called all their friends' houses, searched the neighborhood. We don't know where else to look. I'm so sorry, I said, my voice feeling thin and hollow in the suffocating space. I wish there was something I could do. I could take a flashlight, check the woods myself. The police are doing that now, Mr. Wellwood replied, his voice cracking under the strain. Still, it wouldn't hurt. I'm sure they'll turn up. Probably just got distracted, maybe down by the reservoir or something. Kids don't think about this stuff. They don't think about the consequences. He forced another smile, but it crumbled before it could reach his eyes. He turned back to his wife, hunching forward as a tremor overtook him. Later, I stood at the sink, both taps twisted all the way. Water gushed out, icy and relentless, splashing against my open palms. I splashed wave after wave onto my face, each frigid shock sending shivers down my spine. But the unease wouldn't wash away. Today had been too chaotic, too wrong to let me unwind. April and I had spent the better part of 3 hours trying to comfort the Wellwoods, assuring them that their sons would be found, that they'd turn up. We told them over and over that it was a safe neighborhood, that surely no twisted stranger could have lured them away. My idea of searching the woods myself slowly withered away in the tension-filled room, my voice shrinking with each passing minute. As guilty as I felt, a part of me was relieved when the conversation finally moved on, leaving my suggestion to vanish into the dark. But even as I left it behind, the shadows clung to me. The nagging thought that something far more sinister than a simple disappearance was lurking just beyond the edge of the night. And the silence that followed was too thick, too absolute, like the world itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to go wrong. I squeezed a glob of toothpaste onto my toothbrush, the minty gel curling against the bristles. My stomach gave a low, hollow gurgle as I brought it to my mouth, a dull ache twisting in my gut. I realized I'd never gotten around to eating dinner, only managing to scarf down an apple during a brief pause between meetings around noon. I paused outside the bathroom door, hesitating before heading back downstairs. My eyes drifted down the hallway, drawn toward the far end where the doors to the master bedroom and Kyle's room faced each other like two silent sentinels. I had been the one to tuck Kyle in tonight, no surprises there. But a nagging feeling took hold of me, urging me to double-check, to confirm that he was still safe in his bed. I tiptoed down the hall, each step barely making a sound on the worn wooden floors. I nudged open Kyle's door and peered inside. A small lump lay beneath the covers, facing the far wall. The sight of it brought a rush of relief, and I closed the door gently, careful not to let the latch click too loudly. Turning back toward the master bedroom, I noticed April had left the door ajar. She lay in bed, her body half hidden beneath the covers, the glow from her bedside lamp casting shadows across her face. Her eyes skimmed over the pages of one of her endless self-help books. You can overcome adversity, but I knew she wasn't absorbing a word of it. Her mind was far from those pages, tangled in thoughts about the missing Wellwood boys. I wondered how much this fresh tragedy might set her back, pushing her job search even further into the shadows, leaving me to shoulder the extra weight of our lives. It wasn't hard to imagine that soon, even half the household chores might become too much for her to bear. I decided to leave her be. The confrontation I had planned could wait. There was no point now. The edge of my anger had dulled under the weight of the evening's grim events. By the time I reached the bottom of the stairs, I'd already resigned myself to saving the argument for another night. The dim bulb from the open fridge cast a sickly glow across the kitchen, pooling shadows around me. The shelves were mostly empty, save for a full loaf of grain bread, a quarter block of cheese, and a few cold cuts wrapped in wrinkled white paper. It had probably been over 5 days since April had last ventured out for groceries, on my dime, of course. A quick sandwich would have to do. I gathered the ingredients, setting the bread into the toaster and reaching for the jar of mayo. The fridge door closed with a soft click as I turned on the kitchen light, casting a harsh fluorescent beam over the countertops. I grabbed the cutting board and a knife, slicing into the cheese with a dull rhythm. But as I drew the blade down for the third time, something tugged at the edge of my vision. I froze, my grip tightening on the handle. It came from outside, just beyond the window, barely noticeable, a flicker of light, there and gone in a heartbeat. I set the knife down, feeling a chill settle into my bones. I leaned closer to the window, squinting into the darkness beyond the glass. There, just at the edge of my property where the redwoods loomed tall, I saw it again, 2 faint glints, like eyes reflecting a distant light. Twin pinpricks of brightness, unblinking, staring back at me from the shadows. Raccoons, I told myself, but the explanation felt thin. They often scrounged through the heaps of compost we dragged out there. Still, an uneasy tightness coiled in my chest as I reached over and flicked on the backlights. The bulbs flared to life, washing the patio and the nearest stretch of grass in a harsh white glare. But the edge of the yard, where the trees clawed at the night sky, remained dark and impenetrable. No raccoons scurried into view, no shapes moved at the edge of the light. Just the empty backyard, stretching out into shadows that seemed deeper than before. I lingered for a moment longer, the cold pressing against the window pane, before turning back to the counter, the knife still resting where I'd left it. But a shiver lingered in my hands, and the air around me felt colder, as if something unseen was creeping closer, just out of sight. The compost bin sat by the back door, overflowing with rotting scraps. I couldn't help but let out a bitter chuckle, no point in getting mad about it anymore. The sight of soggy lettuce leaves and crumpled eggshells wasn't exactly appetizing. Before finishing my sandwich, I grabbed the bin and slid open the glass door. A chill swept in, sharper than I remembered from when I'd come home just a couple of hours earlier. The grass crunched beneath my feet as I headed toward the far edge of the yard. The garden stretched nearly to the back fence, a line of wilting flowers that April had planted months ago. She'd wanted the garden to expand further, keeping the same line toward the woods. "There's good sun back here," she'd insisted. "Perfect for growing tomatoes next year. At least we'd save a few bucks on groceries." But tonight, the promise of homegrown vegetables seemed a distant thought. I was nearly to the dumping spot when I saw it again, a glint in the darkness. 4 pinpoints of light hovered in the shadows, but now I realized they weren't on the ground. They were higher up, suspended in the air. Little bastards must be clinging to the trees, I thought, waiting to see if I was bringing them scraps. I tipped the bin, letting the compost slide out, my gaze fixed on the tree line a few feet away. As I strained my eyes, shapes began to resolve themselves in the gloom. Something didn't sit right. I turned back to the garden, shook the bin until the last scraps tumbled out, then started to jog back to the house, eager to put the night behind me. "Reggie." A voice pierced the stillness, so sudden it made my blood run cold. I froze. The pitch was high, unmistakably the voice of a child no older than 10. I turned slowly, staring back at the tree line. This time I saw more. The outlines of the trees, the jagged rocks, the scattered shrubs along the edge of the woods. A low fog slithered out from between the trunks, spilling onto the grass. The lights flashed again. This time they didn't disappear. They stayed fixed in place, revealing their source. Two faces stared out from beneath a bush at the edge of my property. They were not the masked faces of raccoons. They were the pale, hollow faces of two boys' familiar faces. The missing Wellwood brothers. Jeremy and Jason. I stumbled back, my pulse quickening. They were really there, watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. "Help us, Reggie," one of them pleaded, his voice quivering. "It's cold out here. We need to go inside." I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What are you boys doing out here? Your parents? They're worried sick. The police have been searching for you all night. We got lost on the way home, Reggie," they said, their voices flat and stilted, like reciting lines from a script. "Come help us find our way back." I squinted deeper into the darkness. Something about the way they spoke wasn't right, something unnatural, wrong. Their words echoed oddly, their tone too even. "Why aren't you helping us, Reggie?" They both said in unison, their voices perfectly synchronized. The sound clawed at my mind, unnatural and hollow. I took a cautious step forward. The closer I got, the more details came into focus, their skin, pale as moonlight, almost glowing in the darkness. Their eyes, they were wrong. White, blank, empty like the pupils and retinas had been scrubbed away. The fog swirled thicker, curling around their legs and spreading over the ground like icy breath. It lapped at my ankles, numbing my skin. I stiffened, ready to bolt if I needed to. "Come out of the bushes, boys," I urged, forcing my voice to sound steady. "Let's get you inside, get you warm. I'll call your parents and tell them you're all right." "But we're stuck, Reggie," they whispered again, their voices blending together into a dissonant drone. "Our shoes, they're caught in the mud. We can't get out. You have to help us." They paused, and then one spoke again, voice quivering like a broken string. "It's not just us. Kyle's stuck too." The words slammed into me, leaving me paralyzed. A jolt of ice shot through my veins, and my mind spun back to the moment I'd peeked into Kyle's room. The lump under the covers, facing the wall. I had been so sure it was him. But I hadn't checked, hadn't really seen. The fog crept closer, wrapping around my legs, pulling me toward the woods. The boys' pale faces remained fixed on me, unblinking, their eyes voids that swallowed the light. I thought I heard them whisper again, but the sound was swallowed by the wind, carried away into the trees where the darkness waited, patient and deep. I never expected to get caught in whatever twisted game this was. I glared into the darkness at those two pale faces swaying in the bushes. They rocked back and forth, as if the bodies behind them couldn't support the weight of their own heads. But then, I saw it, realization slithered down my spine like ice water. They didn't have bodies at all. Instead, bony arms jutted from the darkness, cradling each head like macabre puppets on strings. The arms were impossibly long, their joints bending at unnatural angles, and they were draped in tattered remnants of what might have once been a suit. Ragged threads clung to the thin limbs, swaying in the breeze. The skin stretched tight over those limbs was the same sickly pale white as the Wellwood boys' faces. The way the arms bent upward, it was like some kind of nightmarish spider hanging upside down, legs twitching toward the sky. "What's the matter, Reggie?" The voices droned, the words coming out in a perfect unison that was all wrong. "Why aren't you helping us? You can't leave us out here. Kyle will freeze to death." That was enough to break whatever spell held me. I turned and sprinted back toward the house, legs pumping through the cold air, heart slamming in my chest. But as I fled, a new voice came from behind me, cutting through the night like a blade. "Dad, please don't run away. Come back here and help." Even through the rush of adrenaline, I could tell something was terribly off. Kyle's voice warped and twisted, like a warped recording playing too fast. An eerie falsetto. It was a mockery, a grotesque mimicry of my son. I reached the back door and slammed it shut with all my strength, locking it, checking it twice. The sound echoed through the dark house. I bolted into the shadows, barely able to catch my breath. It was the longest night of my life. I checked Kyle's room, then Uprol's. Then I checked again. And again. I made sure every door, every window in the house was locked tight. My hands shook as I dialed the police, trying to find words for what I'd seen. It came out in stammered, broken phrases. They said they were already combing the neighborhood. More officers arrived and swept into the woods behind the house. But they never found what I saw. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the top of the stairs, back pressed to the wall between Kyle's door and my bedroom. An aluminum bat from the basement rested in my grip, fingers clenched tight around the cold metal. I stayed there wide-eyed until the first light of dawn crept through the windows. Even with a police cruiser parked outside and my family sleeping peacefully, I couldn't close my eyes. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still out there, watching from the shadows. As the clock ticked closer to 8, I crept back into the bedroom and took April's phone from the nightstand. I scrolled through the contacts until I found it, Cheryl Wellwood. The name hit me with a pang of guilt. I should have remembered it sooner. The phone rang once before she picked up, her voice tired and raw. "Hello. Hi, Cheryl. It's Reggie." I began, but my voice faltered. She sounded annoyed, like she couldn't believe I had the nerve to call so early. "I'm sorry for calling so soon, but I saw your boys last night, in the woods." Silence. My mind struggled to keep up. My grip on the phone slipped, and it clattered to the hardwood floor. As I fumbled to pick it up, her breath caught a soft, pained sound on the other end. The same sound I'd heard the night before in my living room. There was a rustling, a crumpling sound as the phone was handed off to someone else. Mr. Wellwood's voice crackled through the line. "Is that you, Reggie?" he asked, his voice low and strained. "Yeah, is something wrong over there?" My voice came out small, uncertain. "I just told Cheryl. I saw your boys in the woods behind my house last night." There was a long, heavy sigh on the other end. "Not surprised to hear that," he finally replied. "You're not the first. We've been getting the same call all morning, from folks all over the neighborhood. Anyone with a yard backing up to the woods. They all think they saw something out there." His words sent a shudder through me, turning my bones to ice. As I listened, I glanced toward the window, where the trees loomed just beyond the fence line. The morning fog still clung to the grass, drifting like a ghostly curtain between my yard and the dark woods beyond. And I realized with a terrible certainty that whatever game I'd stumbled into, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. A week had crawled by, and we were still holed up at April's sister's place in Sacramento. Like every other night since that terrible encounter in the backyard, I barely slept. We shared the small spare room, April and I on the pull-out couch, Kyle in the cot beside us. I glanced over, watching the steady rise and fall of their breathing, my wife and son deep in peaceful sleep. I could sense their unspoken question hanging in the air, even in sleep. When will we go home? My vacation days were dwindling, and Kyle had already missed too much school. They never asked outright, but I knew the pressure was there, tugging at me to bring us back, to try and pretend like things could ever be normal again. But how could I, when the memory of that night clawed at my thoughts every time I closed my eyes? No one wants to be the one who drags their family away from home over some crazy ghost story. But I wasn't the only one that night. Others from the neighborhood swore they saw the Wellwood boys too. They all had the same story, shadowy figures in the trees, never quite close enough to touch, never coming out when called. But that's all they ever were, shadows. No one found them, and there hadn't been any more sightings since. Still, something gnawed at my mind. A few days after the boys appeared, another neighbor, Bruno Vallejo, vanished. He'd gone into his backyard one evening and never came back. Just like that, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Careful not to wake anyone, I got up and shuffled toward the window, peering out into the night. April's sister's house backed up to a small stretch of brush, just a handful of trees that barely qualified as a forest. The glow of streetlights filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the ground. But despite the light, the sight made me uneasy. The trees seemed to lean in, pressing closer like they held secrets between their dark boughs. I thought back to that night, replaying the moment over and over in my head, the anger, the frustration that drove me out to the backyard in the first place. How desperately I'd wanted to confront April, to settle that pointless argument. How small and meaningless it all felt now, reduced to a bitter memory buried under layers of fear. I left the window and sat at the edge of Kyle's cot. In the darkness, I imagined the sound of his voice saying goodnight, the familiar warmth of it. It was so different from that hideous false echo I'd heard in the woods, something trying to sound like him, but twisted, off-key. The memory made me shudder, but I couldn't help the small smile that crept to my lips. I quickly forced it down, as if there was someone in the shadows watching, judging me for feeling relief in such a twisted situation. I pressed my hands to my face, feeling the cold sweat that still clung to my skin. And as wrong as it felt, I couldn't deny it. There was a deep, undeniable sense of gratitude, a relief that almost made me sick. I still had what mattered most. My family was safe, untouched by whatever darkness had taken the Wellwoods and poor Bruno. It reminded me of those close calls, like the times you narrowly miss a car accident, or when you read about some tragedy on the news that happened in the same place you were, just moments earlier. Life has a cruel way of offering lessons at someone else's expense, sparing you just enough to make you realize what you could have lost. I turned back to look at Kyle, his peaceful face barely visible in the dim light. My smile returned, a flicker of something warm amidst the cold fear. I held onto that feeling, clung to it like a lifeline as I crawled back into bed. And though I kept my eyes shut, sleep still danced just beyond my reach, leaving me alone with the shadows and the whispers of the trees outside.